Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Adventure and Mystery Book Club. I'm Bill Mallory, branch manager of the La Jolla Library. So glad you could join us today for our next reading, our War of the Worlds chapters, book 2, chapter 5 and 6, which we will be reading today. Um, just to tell you a little bit about this, chapters 5 and 6 are very short. So this is actually going to be a little bit of a shorter reading than previously. The next chapter after this, chapter 7, is very large, and it will take the entire time to read that. So we're just going to do the two chapters today, and then on Monday, chapter 7. Um, and since they're so short, well, we can talk a little bit about what's coming up because we are nearly at the end of our book. Uh, Basically, we've got 5 and 6 today, book 2, chapters 5 and 6. We've got chapter 7 on Monday. We will do chapter 8 on Wednesday. And then chapters 9 and 10 are also fairly short, so we can do those in one sitting, and that will be it. Chapter 10 is, in fact, the end of it. And so we'll be thinking about our next book. Now, you may recall that when we had finished Hound of the Baskervilles previously, I had put up several titles up for vote, and of course it was a tie. So War of the Worlds got the same number of votes as 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. So the plan then is to just read them both. Now that we are close to finishing um, War of the Worlds, that we will finish actually a week from today. We'll read the last chapters. Um, then on that following Monday, um, a week from next Monday, we can start 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and that way everyone who voted will be able to their uh, get their choice, at least for the top two anyway. That turned out to be even. So anyway, just a kind of heads up on what's coming up in the future here for the Adventure and Mystery Book Club. Um, just to tell you a little bit about where we stand with our story, a quick little summary here. Our unnamed narrator has been hiding out. He's been seeking shelter and going from house to house, trying to find food and supplies. And coming along with him is a man he met who is known only as the curate. And a curate is a religious person, not a priest, slightly below that in rank, but but still there in the church, um, and he has proven to not be a very good companion, to put it mildly. He is kind of selfish. He's kind of looking out for himself. He's kind of lost his marbles a little bit. This is all proving to be a little bit too much for him. And the narrator actually says in the story, looking at him lose himself is kind of what has made me uh, not do that. It's kind of it's seeing him and the depths to which a person could fall is sort of making him shore up his strength and his courage and do the best he can to not be that person. So in a sense, he was causing a lot of problems for our main character, but he also acknowledges that it was beneficial as a kind of um, reverse example, the example of what not to do, basically. And so as they're searching through one of the houses, the cylinder falls. A cylinder, of course, is what's being shot from Mars, striking the Earth after a certain amount of time, and then from this, the Martians are coming out, and now we saw them kind of watching. Both of them were kind of watching through a hole in the side of the building because there was a big tumult and there was a whole bunch of dirt piled up and it was a big mess and it was a big giant pit now where the cylinder landed, and the Martians have come out and they're building. And not only do they have their tripod fighting machines, they also have what he's calling the handling machines, which, as we have seen, is picking up human beings, and basically the Martians are sort of taking them and draining their blood for food. So there we go. The two characters were trapped for 2 weeks in this broken house next to this Martian pit, where they see them making odd aluminum cylinders out of this hard clay, and constructing more machines in this pit. And the curate has basically has had enough, and he cannot go any further. The protagonist in this says that he has become like an animal, sort of unreasoning, and he starts to shout, and he starts to pray loudly, and he starts to repent all of his sins, of which apparently there are many. And our protagonist uh, tries to get him to be quiet, but he won't. So he takes the butt end of an axe, and he hits him over the head, knocking him out. So he doesn't use the sharp end, but he does use the blunt end of it, and knocks him out. And then, of course, they find out is that the Martians had heard him talking, and one of the mechanical tentacles from the handling machine reaches into the house where he is hiding, and basically picks up the unconscious curate and drags him out. Our main character goes and hides in the scullery, and in the kitchen area, sort of down below. It's kind of like a basement where they keep a lot of coal and firewood, and you can hear all the tentacle moving around in the house, and then finally it all goes silent. So that's where we stand. Our main character is having a rough time of it, and if you're ready, we will start chapter 5, entitled The Stillness. My first act before I went into the pantry was to fasten the door between the kitchen and the scullery. But the pantry was empty. Every scrap of food had gone. Apparently, the Martian had taken it all on the previous day. At that discovery, I despaired for the first time. I took no food or drink on the 11th or 12th day. At first, my mouth and throat were parched, and my strength ebbed sensibly. I sat about in the darkness of the scullery in a state of despondent wretchedness. My mind ran on eating. I thought I had become deaf, for the noises of movement I had been accustomed to hear from the pit had ceased absolutely. I did not feel strong enough to crawl quietly to the peephole, or I would have done so. On the 12th day, my throat was so painful that, taking a chance of alarming the Martians, I attacked the creaking rain-watered pump that stood by the sink and got a couple of glassfuls of blackened and tainted rainwater. I was greatly refreshed by this, and emboldened by the fact that no inquiring tentacle followed the noise of my pumping. During these days, in a rambling, inconclusive way, I thought much of the curate and of the manner of his death. On the 13th day I drank some more water and dozed, and thought disjointedly of eating and of vague, impossible plans of escape. Whenever I dozed, I dreamt of horrible phantasms of the death of the curate, or of sumptuous dinners. But asleep or awake, I felt a keen pain that urged me to drink again and again. The light that came into the scullery was no longer gray, but red. To my disordered imagination it seemed the color of blood. On the 14th day I went into the kitchen, and I was surprised to find that the fronds of red weed had grown right across the hole in the wall, turning the half-light of the place into a crimson-colored obscurity. It was early on the 15th day that I heard a curious, familiar sequence of sounds in the kitchen. Listening, I identified it as the snuffing and scratching of a dog. Going into the kitchen, I saw a dog's nose peering in through a break among the ruddy fronds. This greatly surprised me. At the scent of me, he barked shortly. I thought if I could induce him to come into the place quietly, I should be able, perhaps, to kill and eat him. In any case, it would be advisable to kill him lest his actions attract the attention of the Martians. I crept forward, saying, "Good dog," very softly. But he suddenly withdrew his head and disappeared. I listened. I was not deaf. But certainly the pit was still. I heard a sound like the flutter of birds' wings and a horse croaking, but that was all. For a long while I lay close to the peephole, but not daring to move aside the red plants that obscured it. Once or twice I heard a faint pitter-patter like the feet of a dog going hither and thither on the sand far below me. And there were more bird-like sounds, but that was all. At length, encouraged by the silence, I looked out. Except in the corner, where a multitude of crows hopped and fought over the skeletons of the dead the Martians had consumed, there was not a living thing in the pit. I stared about me, scarcely believing my eyes. All the machinery had gone. Save for the big mound of grayish-blue powder in one corner, certain bars of aluminum in another, the blackbirds, and the skeletons of the killed, the place was merely an empty circular pit in the sand. Slowly I thrust myself out through the red weed and stood upon the mound of rubble. I could see in any direction save behind me to the north, and neither Martians nor signs of Martians were to be seen. The pit dropped sheerly from my feet, but a little way along the rubbish afforded a practicable slope to the summit of the ruins. My chance of escape had come. I began to tremble. I hesitated for some time, and then, in a gust of desperate resolution, and with a heart that throbbed violently, I scrambled to the top of the mound in which I had been buried so long. I looked about again, to the northward, too. No Martian was visible. When I had last seen this part of Sheen in the daylight, it had been a straggling street of comfortable white and red houses, interspersed with abundant shady trees. Now I stood on a mound of smashed brickwork, clay, and gravel, over which spread a multitude of red cactus-shaped plants, knee-high, without a solitary terrestrial growth to dispute their footing. The trees near me were dead and brown, but further on a network of red threads scaled the still-living trunks. The neighboring houses had all been wrecked, but none had been burned. Their walls stood, sometimes to the second story, with smashed windows and shattered doors. The red weed grew tumultuously in their roofless rooms. Below me it was the great pit, with the crows struggling for its refuse. A number of other birds hopped about among the ruins. Far away I saw a gaunt cat slink crouchingly along the wall, but traces of men there were none. The day seemed, by contrast with my recent confinement, dazzlingly bright, the sky a glowing blue. A gentle breeze kept the red weed that covered every scrap of unoccupied ground gently swaying, and oh, the sweetness of the air. Chapter 6. The Work of 15 Days. For some time I stood tottering on the mound, regardless of my safety. Within the noisome den from which I had emerged, I thought with a narrow intensity only of immediate security. I had not realized what had been happening to the world, had not anticipated this startling vision of unfamiliar things. I had expected to see Sheen in ruins, I found about me the landscape weird and lurid of another planet. For that moment I touched an emotion beyond the common range of men, yet one that the poor brutes we dominate know only too well. I felt as a rabbit might feel returning to his burrow, and suddenly confronted by the work of a dozen busy navvies digging the foundation of a house. I felt the first inkling of a thing that presently grew quite clear in my mind, that oppressed me for many days, a sense of dethronement, a persuasion that I was no longer a master, but an animal among the animals under the Martian heel. With us it would be as with them, to lurk and watch, to run and hide. The fear and empire of man had passed away. But as soon as this strangeness had been, I realized it passed, and my dominant motive became the hunger of my long and dismal fast. In the direction away from the pit, I saw, beyond a red-covered wall, a patch of garden still intact. This gave me a hint, and I went knee-deep and sometimes neck-deep in the red weed. The density of the weed gave me a reassuring sense of hiding. The wall was some 6 feet high, and when I attempted to climb it, I found I could not lift my feet to the crest. So I went along the side of it and came to a corner and a rockwork that enabled me to get to the top and tumble into the garden I coveted. Here I found some young onions, a couple of gladiolus bulbs, and a quantity of immature carrots, all of which I secured, and, scrambling over a ruined wall, went on my way through scarlet and crimson trees toward Q. It was like walking through an avenue of gigantic blood drops, possessed with two ideas: to get more food and to limp as soon and as far as my strength permitted out of this accursed unearthly region of the pit. Some way farther in a grassy place was a group of mushrooms, which I also devoured, and then I came upon a brown sheet of flowing shallow water, where meadows used to be. These fragments of nourishment served only to whet my hunger. At first, I was surprised at this flood in a hot, dry summer, but afterward I discovered that it was caused by the tropical exuberance of the red weed. Directly this extraordinary growth encountered water, it straightway became gigantic and of unparalleled fecundity. Its seeds were simply poured down into the water of the Wey and Thames, and its swiftly growing and titanic water fronds speedily choked both those rivers. At Putney, as I afterward saw, the bridge was almost lost in a tangle of this weed. At Richmond, too, the Thames water poured in a broad and shallow stream across the meadows of Hampton and Twickenham. As the waters spread, the weed followed them, until the ruined villas of the Thames Valley were for a time lost in this red swamp, whose margin I explored, and much of the desolation the Martians had caused was concealed. In the end, the red weed succumbed almost as quickly as it had spread, a cankering disease due, it is believed, to the action of certain bacteria presently seized upon it. Now, by the action of natural selection, all terrestrial plants have acquired a resisting power against bacterial diseases. They never succumb without a severe struggle. But the red weed rotted like a thing already dead. The fronds became bleached and then shriveled and brittle. They broke off at the least touch, and the waters that had simulated their early growth carried their last vestiges out to sea. My first act on coming to this water was, of course, to slake my thirst. I drank a great deal of it, and, moved by an impulse, gnawed some fronds of red weed. They were watery and had a sickly, metallic taste. I found the water was sufficiently shallow for me to wade securely, although the red weed impeded my feet a little. But the flood evidently got deeper toward the river, and I turned back to Mortlake. I managed to make out the road by means of occasional ruins of its villas and fences and lamps, and so presently I got out of this spate and made my way to the hill going up toward Roehampton, and came out on Putney Common. Here the scenery changed from the strange and unfamiliar to the wreckage of the familiar. Patches of ground exhibited the devastation of a cyclone. Yet, in a few score yards, I would come upon perfectly undisturbed spaces, and houses with their blinds trimly drawn, and doors closed as if they had been left for a day by the owners, or as if their inhabitants slept within. The red weed was less abundant. The tall trees along the lane were free from the red creeper. I hunted for food among the trees, finding nothing, and I also raided a couple of silent houses, but they had already been broken into and ransacked. I rested for the remainder of the daylight in the shrubbery. In my enfeebled condition, I was too fatigued to push on. All this time, I saw no human beings and no signs of the Martians. I encountered a couple of hungry-looking dogs, but both hurried circuitously away from the advances I made to them. Near Roehampton, I had seen two human skeletons, not bodies, but skeletons picked clean, and in the wood nearby I found the crushed and scattered bones of several cats and rabbits, and the skull of a sheep. But though I gnawed parts of these in my mouth, there was nothing to be got from them. After sunset, I struggled along the road toward Putney, where, I think, the heat ray must have been used for some reason, and in a garden beyond Roehampton I got a quantity of immature potatoes, sufficient to stay my hunger. From this garden one looked down upon Putney and the river. The aspect of this place in the dusk was singularly desolate, blackened trees, blackened, desolate ruins, and down the hill the sheets of the flooded river, red tinged with the weed. And all over, silence. It filled me with indescribable terror to think how swiftly that desolating change had come. For a time I believed that mankind had been swept out of existence, that I stood there alone, the last man left alive. Near by the top of Putney Hill I came upon another skeleton, with the arms dislocated and several yards away from the rest of the body. As I proceeded, I became more and more convinced that the extermination of mankind was, save for such stragglers as myself, already accomplished in this part of the world. The Martians, I thought, had gone on and left the country desolated, seeking food elsewhere. Perhaps, even now, they were destroying Berlin or Paris, or it might be that they had gone northward. And that is the end of chapter 6, and that's where we'll end it. Like I said, two very short chapters this time. Chapter 7 makes up for it by being about 3 times that size, and we'll read that on Monday at 4 p.m. I hope you can join me on Monday, and thank you for being here today, even if it was kind of a short little read. So have a good weekend. Have a good Father's Day for any of the fathers that are out there, and we hope to see you again on Monday at 4 p.m. Thank you, everyone. Have a good one.